Good morning. It is July 7th, 2024. This is historian Stephen Ujifusa, and this is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. Today marks the 72nd anniversary of the completion of the eastbound leg of the maiden voyage of the SS United States. And since this anniversary might very well be the last anniversary that the SS United States continues to exist as a physical object, I feel it is only fitting to try to reconstruct and remember that voyage, and especially those last 2 days where the ship was overflowing with excitement, where the passengers were just eagerly awaiting the moment when that ship crossed the finish line at Bishop's Rock, England, and captured the speed record of the North Atlantic, the Blue Riband. And this would be the first time in 100 years that an American flag vessel had held that record. And the thing that is both amazing and also poignant about this is that the amount of effort, achievement, hard work, and sweat that went into creating this magnificent vessel. As one maritime historian said, she was built like a cathedral. She was built to last forever. The intense perfectionism of William Francis Gibbs and everyone who worked on this ship to create something that was physically so beautiful, but also incredibly fast and strong. Within a few years, the record, the Blue Riband of the Atlantic, something that nations had fought over and spent millions upon millions of dollars for their ships to capture over the past century or so, would be rendered pretty much irrelevant by the arrival of jet aircraft in 1958. And within a few years of the arrival of the first commercial jet passenger aircraft, the transatlantic liners such as the SS United States and the Queen Mary, the Ile-de-France, the Liberté, the Queen Elizabeth, would all be pretty much rendered irrelevant, obsolete. And that era of transatlantic travel will be pretty much forgotten. Today, it continues to live on one ship, the Cunard liner Queen Mary II. But the SS United States in 1952 represented the absolute apogee of the glamour of these ships, of what these ships meant as national symbols. And in 1952, it was America's turn. America had survived the war as the only large Western superpower to emerge unscathed from bombing and destruction. And all the lessons that William Francis Gibbs had learned as a naval architect during World War II were put into this ship, whether it was the engines or fireproof technology. And she was built first and foremost as a troop ship that was in disguise as a luxury liner. But this maiden voyage, where the ship surpassed by far the achievements in terms of speed of any other ship before her, was a magical experience, and those on board the SS United States, whether passengers or crew, would never forget it. And when I showed the chapter A Very Fast Lady from A Man in His Ship that described this maiden voyage, I showed it to Laura Franklin Dunn, who was the president of General John Franklin, the president of the United States Lines. It was a gratifying experience for her to say. And she had been on that trip as a 20-something young woman. She said, "That's how it was." And I would like to read an excerpt from A Man in His Ship, America's greatest naval architect in his quest to build the SS United States, that captures those last 2 days at sea, the excitement, the anticipation, and the triumph. The morning of July 6th showed overcast skies and gray seas, with a 20-knot headwind blowing from the east, but the fog had burned off. Manning asked Kaiser for more steam. The ship that day would be passing several big foreign flag liners heading in the opposite direction, including the French line's Liberté, former Europa, as well as the westbound America. Down in the engine room, Kaiser watched the pressure gauge move higher as the whine of the four turbines grew shriller, almost reaching a shriek. It wasn't only confidence in the SS United States we were gaining as we whipped into the home stretch, Kaiser said, but also confidence in ourselves. The foreign flags had had a monopoly on the Sea Queen business entirely too long. We could build ships to beat them, and we had men smart enough to run the ships too. Every man Jack down in those engine holds was fighting for something, just as Manning had fought and was fighting in the bridge. Those up early enough felt the ship shudder as she picked up even more speed. That ship just took off, musician Walter Scott recalled when the fog lifted. It was unbelievable to me the incredible speed it was traveling. Some guessed she was exceeding 40 land miles per hour through the moderate swells. Second Officer Asterio Alessandrelli took out his 16mm camera and stepped out onto the bridge. He leaned out over the port wing and captured quick shots of the ship's wake foaming violently astern. He then pointed his lens towards the bows. Spray kicked up onto the foredeck as the United States plowed ahead into the steel-gray Atlantic, studded with whitecaps. At 11 a.m., stewards served cups of hot chicken bouillon on tables or carts pushed along rows of deck chairs. After the fog finally lifted, the hardier passengers braved the winds howling across her upper decks, but it was still too windy to play shuffleboard, quoits, or deck tennis. A few played ping-pong in the shelter of the enclosed promenade. At the noon press conference, the reporters managed to get a few words out of William Francis Gibbs. "My expectations are rather high, and the ship is running them hard," he said tersely, then headed back to the bridge with Manning. America appeared on the horizon, heading in the opposite direction, making a steady 22 knots. As the two running mates passed a beam of each other, they exchanged raucous salutes from their whistles. Within a few minutes, America had vanished astern. But there was another westbound liner closing in on the United States from the opposite direction, and judging by the image on the radar bridge screen, she was a big one. Late on the afternoon of July 6th, as darkness closed in, 3 red and black funnels appeared in the distance, belching clouds of black smoke. As she grew closer, passengers could see her prow was kicking up a huge bow wave. When the announcement came over Queen Mary's public address system that the ship was about to pass the new American vessel, passengers watching a movie in her first-class cinema got out of their seats and ran to the starboard rails. Queen Mary was making about 29 knots as she swept past the United States at 5 p.m. The two ships had a combined speed of over 70 land miles per hour. Manning let loose a long bellow from his whistles. Queen Mary's Captain Gratifying responded, and the two ships cut loose with a spine-tingling bass chord that sounded over the Atlantic for miles. The Union Jack dipped from the Queen Mary's mainmast in salute, followed by the stars and stripes from United States' radar mast. Within minutes, Queen Mary's cruiser stern disappeared into the twilight, and the passengers on both ships left the railings and headed below. It was time to dress for dinner. It was gala dinner night on the United States, a traditional ritual for the last evening at sea. All 3 dining rooms were decked out with streamers and balloons, as were the passengers in their party hats and finest clothes. It had been announced over the public address system that the United States would pass Bishop Rock at about 6 in the morning. Most of the passengers planned to stay up through the night and continue to party, a prospect that the already overworked crew dreaded. Outside, the overcast skies continued to darken. Thunderhead clouds grew larger on the horizon, and the winds freshened from the northeast. The United States was steaming into a full gale with winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour. As visibility deteriorated, the radar went on the fritz. Manning became so frustrated that he pushed the repair technician aside and shoved his finger into the device. The shock flung the Commodore against the bridge bulkhead, but amazingly, he was uninjured. As he stood on the bridge watching the prow rise and fall, William Francis Gibbs may have recalled it was that same kind of weather that kept Mauritania from taking the Blue Riband on her maiden voyage in 1907. That Manning was still pouring on the steam through the fog and gale-force winds must have made Gibbs's blood boil. Not only that, but the Commodore was disobeying company orders that the record was not to be beaten by a big margin. Barring an accident, it looked like the margin was going to be huge. As the ship began to sway ominously from side to side, Assistant Bell Captain Krudner, dressed in his full uniform of cutaway and epaulets, stood like a sentry next to the big swinging doors leading to the first-class dining room, pulling them open each time he saw a couple sweep down the grand staircase. Up in the musicians' gallery, the white-jacketed players continued to serenade the diners. Commodore Manning entered the dining room and took his seat at the captain's table. Sitting at his right side was the guest of honor, Margaret Truman. He had reason to be proud. He had announced to the table that on July 6, the United States had broken the record set the day before, clocking 814 miles and tearing through the rough Atlantic at 36.17 knots. At the captain's table were William and Francis Gibbs and Vera Gibbs, sculptress Gwen Lux, Newport News Shipbuilding's William Blewett, and Gibbs & Cox chief engineer Walter Bachman. Since Mr. Gibbs asked me to sit at his table with Mrs. Gibbs and a young woman who was traveling with her, Bachman wrote Elaine Kaplan, sundry misguided people think perhaps I am somebody. As a result, I have met a large proportion of the celebrities on the ship. During dinner, Gibbs asked Blewett if he knew what Miss Lux's sculpture hanging over them represented. Blewett, who knew more about engineering than art, said that he did not. Gravely, Gibbs explained the meaning of the sculpture's German name and proceeded to explain in great detail how the figures represented the four seasons. Gibbs's erudition impressed the dinner guests, especially Blewett. Lux could barely contain her laughter. Mr. Gibbs was making it all up, the artist told the table. The four figures represent the four freedoms, and he knows it perfectly well. In his letter to Kaplan, Bachman also quoted something written by Don Idon, but not published. This has been the maiden voyage, but United States has behaved like no maiden. She is a very fast lady, a woman of the world, sleek, sophisticated, and maybe a little ruthless. Bachman's letter, to be sent ashore as soon as the United States reached Le Havre, was marked airmail. The party moved under the lounges and ballrooms. Horse racing started at 9:15 in the first-class ballroom. The ponies were aluminum, moved by bellboys across the dance floor, following rolls of the dice, which moved some horses faster than others. For those who wanted the silver screen, the theater offered She's Working Her Way Through College, starring Virginia Mayo and Ronald Reagan. The gala began at 10:30 p.m. Revelers in party hats drank champagne and spun around to the strains of the orchestra, whose tunes probably included Cole Porter's exuberant Ridin' High. In the wee hours of the morning, Laura Franklin, who was full of champagne, headed up a conga line consisting of Margaret Truman, Drusy Snyder, and a few newspaper reporters. After circling the ballroom, they paraded down the enclosed promenade deck and then up several flights of stairs to the bridge. The two women, braving the pelting rain and ignoring the do not enter signs, found Commodore Manning, William Francis Gibbs, and a clutch of officers on the bridge, their faces illuminated by the pale light of the ship's compass. When Manning saw the conga line burst into the bridge house, he bellowed, "What are you doing here?" Then he saw Margaret Truman. "Miss Truman, we're about to break the record," he said quietly. "Would you like to put your finger on the wheel?" Margaret wrapped her fingers around the spokes for a few moments. "Let Laura do it," Margaret said, looking at Commodore Manning. The president's daughter let go of the wheel and moved aside. Laura put her fingers on the spokes. A few seconds of this was too much for Manning, even if it was General Franklin's daughter. "Please leave," he hissed in Laura's ear. The two women retreated to the ballroom with the revelers in tow. Laura then went down to her parents' suite to wake up her father. "Daddy, we're about to break the record," she shouted. General Franklin rubbed his eyes and looked out of the porthole at the ocean racing past. The ship was going fast, too fast, he thought. He started cursing. Manning was defying company orders to slow down in bad weather. By then, hundreds of passengers had packed the first-class ballroom, champagne glasses in hand and tension building. The captain promised to sound the whistle if the record was broken. At 6:16 a.m., Manning and the officers spotted the flashing Bishop Rock lighthouse, perched on an outcrop through the fog. As she swept by the stone beacon that marked the end of the eastbound Blue Riband course, her three whistles let loose a great bellow that shook the entire ship. Within seconds, the whistle blasts were followed by popping champagne corks, music from the three orchestras, and celebratory cheers and singing from 1,660 passengers. The party spilled out onto the promenades. People sang and danced as musicians marched up and down the decks playing the Star-Spangled Banner. The stewards did not cheer quite so loudly. The crew could not have cared less, deck steward Jim Green recalled. They were so tired. Margaret Truman was with Commodore Manning on the bridge. Both had their eyes fixed on the clock. "Congratulations," she said, her face beaming. They shook hands, and Manning walked away, exhausted. United States time for that eastbound voyage was 3 days, 10 hours, and 42 minutes. She had slashed the Queen Mary's record time by an astonishing 10 hours. On this first run, steaming so fast that the Atlantic waters stripped most of the black paint off her bow, the United States had achieved an average speed of 35.59 knots, a full 4 knots faster than the Queen Mary's earlier record run. This is Stephen Ujifusa, Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. Thank you so much for listening.